Hello and welcome to Unwatchables. Listen and understand, these films are out there. They can't be bargained with. They can't be reasoned with. They don't feel pity or remorse or fear, and they absolutely will not stop ever until you are dead. I am Marc Dottavio.
And I'm Seth Troyer.
And today we welcome film critic Carlos Aguilar to discuss one of the most original voices in filmmaking of the last 15 years. Greek writer/director Yorgos Lanthimos has been compared to the likes of Michael Haneke and Luis Buñuel, with films that are often surreal, darkly hilarious, and horrifically violent at once. Today we're tackling what are arguably the two most provocative and disturbing works in his filmography: his 2009 ultra-dark comedy breakthrough Dogtooth and 2017's twisted thriller/morality play, The Killing of a Sacred Deer. All right. Thank you. And bonus points for anyone who could name the film I was quoting there at the top. Or should we maybe have listeners write in for that one?
Yeah, I think
Ring
we're
any
going to need a
bells?
listener's
Go into
help.
Anchor
I
and
don't
you can leave us a
remember.
voice message. No one's ever done that so far. If you want to be the first listener to ever leave us a voice message, answer riddle, and we'll give you a hat or something. We don't have merch, so it'll just be a regular hat. It won't be an Unwatchables hat. But
Yes. A little hint.
merch yet.
It rhymes with the Perminator. You can cut that out if you want.
Oh my. Yeah. Good job correcting. He is one of the most original filmmakers out there right now, but maybe not the most original.
One of, yeah. I wouldn't say.
That was a good correction.
Yeah.
Because you then listed Michael Haneke and all these other people.
Well, it's subjective.
Just proof that he's probably not the most.
Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see where our opinions land on that. But I do want to first welcome Carlos, whose film writing has appeared in publications all over, including the LA Times, RogerEbert.com, Variety, the New York Times, The Wrap, IndieWire, Vulture, Slate, and many more. He's also served as a screener for the Sundance Film Festival and a screenplay reader for Sundance's Screenwriters Lab, as well as the co-host of the film podcast 1 Week Only. That's really just touching on his credits. But Carlos, thank you for taking time out during this busy awards season to talk some Yorgos with us.
Thank you for having me.
Have they been keeping you busy with all of these different awards shows?
Yeah, it's been a long season. I feel like it's been going on for months and months and months on end, but we're at the tail end of it, so it's almost over.
All right, good. And by the time this episode comes out, I think we'll be past when like the Oscars have aired and everything. But this is kind of an appropriate episode because we will be talking about some actors, especially who are up for, big awards in movies this year, which we'll get to in our second film. But I want to start out talking about Yorgos Lanthimos. This was your pick out of the list of options that we had for episodes. So was there something in particular that made you want to, return to his stuff?
I mean, I've always been a big fan of him since Doctor. I've gotten a chance to interview him a couple times for The Lobster and The Favorite. But yeah, I've always been a big fan of his work. Just his brand of kind of very strange, dark satire has always worked for me. And I think that, although The Killing of a Sacred Deer is not my favorite of his, I still hold it in like a very positive light. I think Dogtooth might still be my favorite, and I kind of long for the day he returns to make another movie in Greece, because I tend to feel that filmmakers, once they break out of their country of origin, they evolve and make interesting things that still have their signature, but it's always great to see them make something back in their original sort of environment and language. So hopefully he finishes that trilogy of sorts with Dogtooth and Alps.
Yeah, that'd be great. So since you've actually talked to him before, I mean, was there any like particular impression that he left? Is he like a, some sort of creepy, all powerful guy like he seems behind the camera? Or
Did he put a curse on you?
Not at all. He was just very chill and relaxed. I talked to him in person. It's been now, I don't know, a few years when The Lobster finally was released. And, it was very interesting because, not to get ahead of myself, but when Doctor was released, there were a lot of I'm Mexican, and so I kind of follow a lot of like what the Mexican Twitter talks about and sort of like the conversations online. And there was a movie from the 1970s, a Mexican film called The Castle of Purity, by a very famous Mexican director, Arturo Ripstein, one of sort of like the fathers of Mexican cinema in the 20th century. And so that movie, a lot of people, when Doctor was released in Latin America, a lot of people compared it to Doctor because the premise is very similar. The Castle of Purity is about a father who has a son and a daughter and a wife, and they're teenagers, and he has never allowed them to be in contact with the outside world. And so he is the only one that goes outside, and he feels like the outside world is going to corrupt them. So basically a very, very similar premise. And so that's what when I met Yorgos, I asked him about it, and he didn't know the film before he wrote Doctor, but in the aftermath of like sort of like people bringing it up to him, he mentioned that he could see the comparisons. And I think that's very fascinating that decades apart this idea can materialize almost in this exact same way.
I had no idea about that. I have to see that.
Yeah, I don't know. It might be on YouTube, maybe without English subtitles though, because it's a movie from the 70s. But yeah, that was the first reference that when I saw Doctor, I immediately thought of that film, because it's essentially the same premise. Although we'll say the Mexican film doesn't have the humor and the satire. It's a very much kind of solemn, darker story that ends badly.
Yeah, that was going to be my question, because Dogtooth seems to be a really unique and exact film tonally, and I would imagine that would be a harder thing to steal from an earlier film.
Right.
But it is such a great premise. And just for anybody listening who doesn't know about Yorgos Lanthimos, and he is becoming a more well-known filmmaker now, especially since he started making English language films. But he is a Greek filmmaker who came from Athens and actually was a pro basketball player for a little bit in Greece, which I thought was interesting, right? And Dogtooth actually is either his second or third film, depending on whether you count this feature that he co-directed called My Best Friend, which would be his first, but there was another credited director, and it sounds like it's a much more conventional film. But Kineta is the one that I haven't seen myself, but from what I understand, kind of started to establish this more singular style that he works in. So have you
seen that one?
Yeah, I've seen that. It was not available in the US for a long time, and I think maybe 1 or 2 years ago, Kino Lorber released it on DVD and Blu-ray in the US, so it is available now to watch. And I guess going back to what I said earlier, to finish the trilogy of Doctor and Alps, maybe in fact it feels maybe like Kineta, Doctor, and Alps are already sort of like a trilogy, although the weirder sort of like elements that sort of exist in the latter two aren't as sort of pronounced in Kineta. But yeah, it's available now, which I think is great, because for a long time it was not even available in the US. I feel like the fact that he's gotten so much prominence now with The Favorite and The Lobster, and the several projects he has in the works now, kind of encourage the distributor to bring it. It might have also gotten a small theatrical release in the US right before they put it out on home video, so it's worth checking out.
Okay, yeah, I'm definitely interested, because a lot of people could probably be forgiven for thinking Dogtooth was his debut film, because it made such a big splash when it premiered in 2009 at the Cannes Film Festival, and it actually won their Un Certain Regard award, which it's kind of a sidebar, like parallel competition to the Palme d'Or. The main competition that I guess focuses on up and comers, or what they would call more unconventional or daring visions, which I think Dogtooth definitely would fall under. I think it'd be strong enough to be in the main competition, but it did get attention there to the point where it ended up being the best foreign language nominee for the Oscars for Greece. So it did make a big splash when it very first came out, and a lot of people had, I think, kind of it was celebrated, but I've definitely read some polarized opinions of people who don't really respond to his style. And I
remember the word of mouth being really strong when it came out. Like, even as just I was just in high school, like, just blooming as like a film fan, and I remember like even then, like hearing a lot about it, which is really impressive how word spread about it. And I think it was this thing that was like this is added to the lists of like, this is a fucked up movie. Like the kids that were looking for that sort of thing, I remember them talking about this movie. And it was like very exciting when it came out or something. I remember that.
Yeah, I mean, it was nominated for an Oscar, which is kind of like one of the most shocking sort of nominations I in a long time. It almost feels kind of like the exact type of movie that would never receive that type of acclaim. Well, of course, Greece selected it as a representative, but then the Academy actually nominated it as like the five finalists. That's the last time that Greece ever received a nomination, and for a for a group that deservingly gets a lot of flack for being unadventurous and sort of like wanting kind of embracing conventional stories, the fact that there was a group among them that saw this movie and decided to put it forward and eventually make it to the five nominees. It's really sort of like, I don't want to say it's given him a career, but I do feel like getting that first Oscar nomination and sort of like getting him exposed to the international English language industry really probably pushed his career much faster than if he had not received that Oscar nomination. It probably would have taken him longer to take that big step. And so for all the sort of a bad bad rap that the Oscars and awards in general get, once in a while the purpose of them actually bringing a film like this to the mainstream, they actually serve their purpose once in a while.
Yeah, I'm sure it definitely led to down the road. Like I heard that like Colin Farrell and Nicole Kidman were like approaching him, like in correspondence with him to like, I want to be in a movie. I heard you're doing a project, like, which is pretty wild. If you like, especially just not something I would anticipate, like seeing Dogtooth initially in 2009 being like, this guy is gonna like go on to have these big actors and like really go over in such a big way. I almost like wondered, I wanted to look into it if there was sort of like a like scene a little bit, like almost like I could imagine like there would be like imitators, like some sort of Greek extreme. Like I was almost wondering if something like that happened around that time, if there were other movies like that.
I feel like what happened was that when Dogtooth broke out, I think someone, a critic, coined sort of this term, the Greek weird wave, and sort of around the time that Doctor came out, there were a lot of other filmmakers from Greece that started making films with a very similar kind of idiosyncratic voice, kind of satirical. Athena Sangari is another one of those filmmakers. She made a film called Adamberg and Chevalier. And they're also very on the same wavelength as Dogtooth and Alps, which is Yorgos' second film. And throughout the years, there've been a lot of Greek filmmakers who make these movies that are kind of on the same, strange and violent perhaps, and sort of like questioning, morality, and the ethics of humanity. There was a movie called Pity that premiered at Sundance a couple years ago about a man who's obsessed with getting, getting pity from people for the, he causes. He basically creates drama in his whole life and terrible situations. He wants bad things to happen to him only so other people can feel sorry for him. And it's a comedy and it's very weird and uncomfortable. And so like all these Greek movies, whether there is something that collectively they all share in terms of like a national identity or a cultural identity, whether that's a fact or not, when you watch a bunch of them from Greece, it's kind of inevitable that you feel like there is something that connects them all. And I think all of these filmmakers have been asked about whether there is a Greek weird wave, and they all say like, "Well, we're all making our own movies," but who knows what it is really that sort of makes them all have the same wavelength. But I think it all started with Dogtooth. That's when, like, internationally at least, people started noticing this trend in Greek cinema.
It's interesting
That's
too
amazing.
that the other foreign language film nominees that year had films by Alejandro Inarritu and Denis Villeneuve, filmmakers who, just like Yorgos Lanthimos, have crossed over and are now making English language prestige films that have been winning awards at the Oscars. Just like Lanthimos did with The Favorite, which, we can touch on a little bit later too, but that was, another kind of full circle moment where he was getting this kind of mainstream recognition from people who had not really considered these. And, it's worth asking whether that feels a little watered down compared to his, original screenplays.
All right. I mean, I do feel like the charm of not the charm, but sort of like the admirable thing about Yorgos Lanthimos is that even though he's crossed over to larger budgets and to a different language, I still think that the essence of his weirdness and his very peculiar way of telling stories remains. The lobster is a very strange premise. The killing of a sacred deer. I still think that he's somehow managed to convince the larger industry and A-list talent to, like, he hasn't molded himself to it. He's kind of like invited people to join into his peculiar way of telling stories, which I think is very unique. Not everyone can do that. A lot of filmmakers sort of like they suffer doing that transition. Some of them make their worst film when they venture into making an English language movie. Like the director of The Lives of Others, the German film that won the Oscar in 2007. He made his follow-up movie was The Tourist, with Johnny Depp and Angelina Jolie, which is a terrible, terrible film. And then he went back and made, he went back to make another German movie, which, got an Oscar nomination. So once he went back to make a German movie, kind of, his career rebounds. But so not everyone can, retain their essence while still making a movie that will satisfy, the larger powers that be in the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good way to start talking about Dogtooth then, as kind of his origin story. For anybody listening who hasn't seen the film, it has a really fantastic premise in both senses of the word. Which, just to summarize real quick, is basically a family that lives isolated at home, and the only one who gets to leave to go to work every day is the father, where the mother and the 3 adult children, or they seem somewhere in their young adulthood, have been raised completely separated from the outside world, to the point where the parents control their reality in the smallest and sometimes most arbitrary and ridiculous kind of ways. And we're basically thrust into this little world as they slowly start to get some kind of an idea of outside influences. But that's pretty much all that you really need to know. But I want to talk about his style, because there were a lot of comparisons to Michael Haneke and even Stanley Kubrick when this movie came out, which I think has to do with the very precise framing and maybe this kind of sense of clinical or emotional distance, which I think in this case really works wonders just with the deadpan comedy, if you want to go that far. I don't know how funny anybody else found this movie, but right. I don't know. Did you guys laugh during this?
I did. I mean, I found the I don't want to spoil it, but like there's a scene with a cat is involved that I always find really perversely funny and hilarious. And that's, of course, that's again why I am always, perpetually shocked that this movie appealed to enough Oscar voters to make it to the final 5 nominees of the Oscars, because it's such a tone specific movie that might be very off-putting for a lot of people, and the situations that this young people are engaging in because of the way that they've been raised are very morally questionable. But I do think that there are moments that are so absurd in the way that they're designed that they're very funny, while at the same time being very insightful about what the movie's trying to say about the world and how we become who we become.
Yeah, there's also there's something, even if it isn't funny, there are certain moments that feel, I don't know, dreamy or light almost in a certain respect, that a lot of the scenes have to do with the way that the children, which quote unquote children, they are these especially the older guy, like they are like acting like children, but they are clearly like later teens, possibly getting into their 20s, like, and still like playing these weird games. A lot of it is like these weird endurance games where they like hold their fingers under hot water was one of them. They have another game where there's like, if a plane goes overhead, the mom might throw a plastic airplane into the yard, and that's like a big thing where then like, okay, the airplane fell in the yard and we can grab it. Whoever grabs it, it's like a big trophy for them to win.
And they think it's
another...
the real airplane they saw in the sky. Like,
you're right. Yes,
but
we caught it.
All goes back to kind of but to me, what I gather from the film always is the idea that we only know what we know because someone has told us that that's how the way it works, right? Like you only know what this thing is called because as your parents told you or someone told you that this thing is called a cat or this thing is called a dog, and they're different things, and you only know the extent to which those people that are raising you explain the world to you. And so we, when we're younger, we're very much sort of like we're easy to shape or to mislead or to be misguided by whoever is sort of inputting information in our mind. And so what has happened here is these young adults have grown in a microcosm that their father has created, that their vision of reality is completely disconnected from what we know. And I think that that's what makes it so fascinating and so like strange to sort of like enter their world.
And part of what's so funny about it is that
the
words exactly was what I was going to say is this. There's really no reason that they have to be taught that the word sea is what they use for chair, or carbine is actually a kind of bird, or they're sitting at the dinner table and they say, "Can you pass the phone?" And they get handed a shaker of salt. And it's funny because it's so arbitrary, yet it just shows that that's how, microscopic the level of control gets down to, almost like they're just doing that to ensure that there's nothing that they know or think that isn't in control of the parents. And there's so many different ways you can read this movie that it kind of seems like a dystopia to me, like a little, insular community where they have total control over what's considered right and wrong. And like you were saying, the power that is in what you call things. And that,
right. Yeah. I mean, like you mentioned in control, like it's also, if they are, at some point allowed in the outside world, they wouldn't even be able to communicate with the rest of the world correctly because the words mean something else to them. And so it's in a way, a way to control them, to prevent that they could even communicate what they're actually trying to say to someone in the outside world. Sort of they're so isolated that even if they manage to escape, they will still be isolated because their experience has already been, so sort of shaped by how their parents raised them. So like they wouldn't even be able to hold a conversation with someone else because the words that they use don't mean the same thing for the rest of the world.
Right, and it's always the drama of the movie is both following where the mindsets of the children go with every twist and turn of the narrative, which we also watch behind the scenes as the parents are having these little like just as equally strange interactions where they are like planning these situations and how like, okay, so-and-so figured out something, so we have to do some sort of rebuttal about it. They also have this like weird secret, like they can read each other's lips, or they like lick into each other's ears so that no one could possibly hear what they are planning, and like behind the kids' backs, even though everyone's already asleep and everything. And following the parents' interactions are these like frustrating, because you're like, okay, maybe now I'll start to like follow the thread and figure out what this is all about. Because like at first you're like, is it as simple as like they are just like super conservative and they're like, which is a big part of it, and there is sort of a discussion at a certain point where the father reveals like, like when he's very angry at this one character who like betrays his trust in like who he lets into the microcosm of the family, and he said like his great curse to her at the end of actually beating her with a VCR is that I hope you have children, and I hope that they have what is it? Evil influence, bad influences get into them, and that they have bad personalities. And he leaves. So in a way, you're like, is it as simple as that he is just like, he has this weird, bizarre like worldview? It's also some of the discussions that the parents have about the ideas, like the things that they're going to introduce happen like during their like sexual, like you wonder if there's some sort of like thing where they're getting off on the power of it all, even beyond that, like they think that they know better. It's like they're getting off on the fact that they can tell this little girl that that is a phone that she is shaking onto her steak. It's just a lot, and I think every time you return to it, there's actually still some questions.
Yeah, and it's also about how quickly we are influenced by other things, right? Like the moment they watch an American movie, they start to memorize the lines, and that already kind of becomes an outside sort of like entity that comes into this world.
Oh,
But
yeah, she watches Rocky.
yeah, but if you think about it, like all of us are sort of in a way, if we didn't have access to the information the way we have it now, that's why religions work for so long. Because how could you, or flat earth, if someone, hundreds of years ago told you that the earth is flat, how can you prove that it's not? Like if I, I've never been to Japan, but I know that Japan exists because I've seen photos of it, images. But realistically, if I didn't have that information, how can I prove that this thing outside of my reality actually exists, other than other information? So we're really subjected to, you know the limit of information that we have. And so that's how religions, and cults and all these other things manage to have power with people, by limiting their access to disproving these ideas. And so, yeah, that's why I think this movie is so fascinating and interesting, that it talks about such big ideas with a very small premise, a small cast, and small resources. It's really just about the writing and the execution.
I like the way
Yeah.
you put that, because that is like what's at the heart of it, is like this gleeful, like absurdism, like kind of with like a devilish smile about it, that is like, we are so confident in ourselves, in our logic, in the way civilization works, in the way social cues work and everything like that, when so much of it, when it can be easily broken down into a lot of jumps and assumptions, really,
Yeah, that's why
which
people are so prone to
is
conspiracy
frightening.
theories. People want conspiracy
Sure.
theories because it allows them a sense of control, a sense of there's a logic to the logical, ways of the world. And so when you can control these things and give a reason for everything, then you have power over people.
Yeah, and it shows how any little crack in that structure can lead slowly to the whole thing crumbling. And that's one of the best jokes of the movie, is the reveal that these videotapes that one of the sisters comes upon and is given by a woman who's brought in basically to have sex with the son. And it's so tightly controlled that she gives one of the girls a piece, like a sparkly headband that's basically considered contraband there, because that's come from the outside world. But then later we find out that the movies that get left there are Rocky and Jaws, I believe, because the one girl is going around reading like and reciting
Oh, yeah.
lines like a child, basically, and acting out the film, which anybody can relate to. And the fact that that kind of thing is what sows the seeds of revolt inside of here is very amusing. And you could really place this into all these different contexts. You could compare this to a cult, to a dictatorship government, to any kind of small town, or more so today than when this first came out, the internet. We were talking about conspiracy theories. It's very
Sure.
easily to insulate yourself inside a chat group or forums or something, and control yourself what information you want to hear and don't want to hear. And
Right,
I,
just
I love how
perpetuate
malleable
your
that
own.
is. That you
Yeah.
can read this in so many different ways, while at the same time it doesn't necessarily beg to be taken as an allegory. Like we just recently talked about another dog movie called Dogville, that really, besides the title, it really insists on being read metaphorically with the way the movie is set up and made artificial. And this one is brilliant because it works in this very specific absurdist scenario just on its own terms as a comedy, but it's so ripe that you're welcome to read into any kind of different level you want.
Yeah, you could even read it, I mean, on a more hopeful level. You could even read it as, Yorgos talking about kind of like the indomitable curiosity of the human mind, that even when you're under this, constraints, and even when you're like in this microcosm of control, there's always something in there that makes you want to learn more, and that, the moment you get a spark of freedom, you are gonna chase it. That it is in human nature to sort of like, want to see beyond the walls, beyond the limits of what we know. That exploratory, why people try to discover other places or investigate. You could also take it as that even if this father wants to keep a tight ship, the moment there's a crack, the moment there's a glimmer of hope to find something else, the kids are gonna take it, because there's something in them that makes them want to explore beyond the walls of their home.
No, yeah, and that is one of the aspects that I think kind of makes it transcend from what maybe at first glance feels like maybe just a weird experiment as a movie, or just like a weird kind of like what the fuck kind of horror movie. There is something really fascinating about tracking the youngest, which is the who is they don't have names. That's another aspect of this. Am I if I'm not mistaken, uh the children like refer to each other as like the eldest or sister or brother. Like most of the time they don't really
Yeah,
have
because
actual
and I think
names.
that goes
Um
back to the words, like when you don't have a name that's for yourself, right? Like when you don't even get to have like something that identifies you as a unique singular person, you even denied that, right? So that to me speaks also about that level of control, that they don't even get to own that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it says to you're about the collective, and the youngest is slowly tunneling her way out of this whole confusing maze, and it's very exciting, especially by the end when she is like by various means, by like finding things from the outside and also like going through the methods that she's been taught, which is I forget how it all works, but if you get rid of your dog tooth, if you lose your dog tooth, you can escape, which
And you're
she
ready
has
to
to
go
like
to the outside world.
jam her tooth out, which is one of the most intense and like cathartic. Like it almost feels like she's clearly in pain, but she's also like so psyched that she's getting this tooth out because she's bashing
See, like,
herself with a weight in front of the mirror and blood is splattering everywhere, and she's like so ready to get the fuck out of there.
what's interesting to me about that is that even though she is seeking freedom and she wants to break out, she's only doing it by still following the rules that she's always known. You know what I'm
Right.
saying? Like she wants to leave, she wants to get out, but she's still doing it by following the procedures that the father has instructed her that this is the only way she can get out. It's not like she just randomly leaves. Like she still, she fulfills the prophecy that the father has instilled in her, and then she can move. So in a way, it means to me that means that like no matter if she escapes, she's still a part of that. It's I don't know if it's too late, but it's so ingrained within her that even to take that step, she has to do it by the rules of the father.
Right, which most of our own, like, even like whether it's spiritual or ways of transcending, are still, like, I think a lot of schools of thought go back to saying it as like we are still seeing like only half the picture. The answers that we do have are probably not the actual answers. They are just ways out into something a greater place. Of course, I've read a lot how this adheres to Plato's the cave, the whole metaphor of the cave and all that. Of just like it is only just the beginning. The like, and you have to use just these like assumptions that are not the actual answer to burrow out of this, to get anywhere where something even resembling a wider truth can be found, which is really profound for a wild movie like this, that I did not anticipate the first time I watched this.
You could even argue, that she is in her own way finding a kind of loophole to the rule, because it's intended to mean that that tooth's never going to fall out and they're never going to leave. And she's like, well, fuck that. I'm going to take the tooth out myself and leave it in this big bloody mess in the bathroom, which is, one of the reasons this is on, a podcast like this, that's one of the more disturbing scenes, along with the cat scene, even though I did find that hilarious too. Which, and just for anybody listening, they basically find a cat and are freaked out because they've never seen one before. So the brother kills it with a pair of garden shears. But the way that the dad then comes home and covers himself in fake blood and chops up his clothes, it always gets a laugh out of me when he emerges and says, "Well,
And
this
making up a
this
fake
beast
brother?
killed your fake brother behind the fence," and
Well,
he
that's what I'm
brings
saying.
home.
Like they believe the brother exists even though they haven't seen it because they told
Mhm.
them. It's like you can believe that something exists beyond your reach. Because you believe, so you trust someone that's telling you that that's the case.
Absolutely. And I think that you could even keep this movie on the level just of the nuclear family as a kind of perversion or satire of that. Because I do feel like there's kind of a patriarchal thing specifically going on here with, the dad being specifically in control, and that
Yes.
he does bring this security guard home for the brother to have sex with. And then once she is banished from the house, he basically lets the brother pick which sister he would like to start having sex with, which does keep happening. And
Oh yeah.
you could almost look at this just being like a push to a comic or horrific extreme, specifically of this patriarchal family structure, and, the lengths to go to preserve it. And not only that,
Well,
but
yeah.
that when they have this inability to think for themselves, it even allows that outsider to be manipulative to them very easily, because she trades that headband for oral sex basically from, one of the daughters, which is just
Right.
another little wrinkle in there that they keep finding ways to exploit this premise and keep it fresh the whole movie.
I mean, just one of the little lottery things of like what family you happen to be born into has so much to do with how like your trajectory, at least at the very least in your early life, and the way you see the world. And there might be a lot of things that you have to break out of and change. And like if you aren't able to be exposed to certain things, it's like, yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Like one family, someone can be brought up in a way that like once they reach public school, they can be like, well, everything is controlled by a giant man in the sky who like created everything. And then like the next door neighbor who goes to the same school, their kid goes and like, what are you talking about? Like that's like
Yeah.
that is like the great disparagement that goes on like
I
in
think
our own
that's
reality.
a good segue to talk about the killing of a sacred deer, because that's a similar dynamic. This family believes that this young person that's entered the world has the power to cause the death of all of them if they don't abide by his terms. I think Nicole Kidman's character in that movie really believes that this young kid has some sort of supernatural, otherworldly, control over them. And then we're left to believe, whether this is, you know uh, is he poisoning them? Does he have power? Does he not? But I think it's based on the same sort of idea of like what we believe, because someone is sort of doing enough for us to believe that what they're saying is true, or they're created an environment in which, whether promising that's going to happen is actually taking place.
I love that because it also filters through the lobster, some of the concepts in there, whereas like so much of it has to do with these mental states that the characters are in that put them in these borderline like science fiction situations where it's like nothing is necessarily seen on the screen. We're not seeing anything like bizarre or strange necessarily, but for some reason like something has been broken here, like, and the
Yeah, in the
characters are
in the
acting in
lobster,
a way.
you don't see people literally transforming into animals,
It's the
but within
indivisibility of it.
within the parameters of this narrative, that's what they all believe, and that's what we believe. And in Alps is almost is similar too, because in Alps is a movie, about people hiring people to pretend to be their loved ones so that they can grieve. And so it's sort of like this, self, yeah, you're sort of like convincing yourself that this person, or wanting to believe that this person is, inhabiting the place of someone you love, just for your mental sake. It's about these ideas that we buy into for whatever reason, or they're being indoctrinated into to make sense of the world.
Yeah, that is a great transition into the movies he has done since Dogtooth. So before we go into the next film, are there any? I want to give everyone a chance just to say their final thoughts. Whether you would unwatch the movie if you could, and I'll go ahead and start here, and then we can go to Seth, and then let Carlos finish us off. But as far as Dogtooth goes, it really does. I haven't seen it in a while, and it felt as fresh to me watching it yesterday as it did when I first saw it. I really think it does stand the test of time, and that all these different readings that we've been bringing to it are all there because it doesn't limit itself to one, and it only works because it is so entertaining moment to moment. That I really did find this to be funny in the darkest and most twisted kind of way, but he really just keeps finding all these different wrinkles, whether it's the dad coming home and dropping fish in the pool just so that they think, oh gosh, now there's fish that are living, that sometimes fish just appear in the pool. Or we listen to, I'd totally forgotten about him saying, all right, who wants to listen to Grandfather? And everyone wants to listen to it. And it turns out to be Frank Sinatra that he's playing on the turntable while he's translating the lyrics to what they actually aren't saying. And it's just great idea after great idea like that. And the style works in a great kind of opposition to that by just taking a step back and letting us see the absurdism for what it is. So I would definitely not unwatch Dogtooth, and I still my favorite film by him. How about you, Seth?
I'd agree. I mean, there's no way I would unwatch this one. And again, it's like, yeah, pretty apparent by this point in the podcast, but it is. I kind of agree that I am kind of waiting. I love all the movies that I've seen by him, but I'm kind of waiting for his answer to Dogtooth or his next step, because I do think this is the high point for me. There is something so singular about this movie too. Well, there are, as we discussed, very interesting through lines. For instance, there's the invisible dread of it, or the invisible thing that is broken, the science fiction aspect of it, which is just a very smart thing even for young filmmakers to learn from this, that your concept can be as simple as this. I mean, and as complicated as this. And it can only, you only need 6 people in the movie, and it's absolutely a bonkers, phenomenal head trip. And I do think it elevates itself as far as there's something about its aesthetic for me. I love the colors. The whole there's something about the pool. I don't know. It's a very unspoken thing about Dogtooth that, again, is a beyond just it being this interesting concept that has weird, strange, surreal elements. It does have this dreamy atmosphere that I really do enjoy going back to, even if it is a difficult watch. Yeah, I think, and it also just really frightens me. I think anyone it can see, even if they had the most wonderful upbringing, can see just the dangers and pitfalls of having that kind of power in a family situation, or not having that kind of power and being the child in that situation of a familial coupling, which is just, it's a lot to take in, and it's a lot of assumptions that we allow ourselves to buy into, that once we zoom out from, can seem kind of horrifying and teetering on the edge of something. I love Dogtooth. I'll shut up about it.
And so, Carlos, what was there anything that's new, or changed for you in the 14 years that we've been living with Dogtooth now?
No, I mean, I think it just reinforce my love for Dogtooth and for Yorgos's movies. I will say that it's probably my favorite tie with the Lobster, and I said it earlier, but I do think that he's managed to continue to, I don't think I am waiting for his something similar to Doctor, because I feel that he hasn't lost the edge yet in the movies that he's made since, and I think that's You can see that in even The Favorite and The Lobster or The Killing of a Sacred Deer. I feel like he has invited people to join his wavelength rather than changing. I think that's really fantastic that a film like Doctor could open the door for him to bring his peculiar madness into the world.
Yes, and he did with full force after this movie. You did mention Alps, which was his follow up, and The Lobster really was kind of another watershed for him from 2015. Not only because it was his first English language movie, which I don't know if we even mentioned that Dogtooth, is in Greek, as was Alps. But also, he started working with Colin Farrell, who comes back for The Killing of a Sacred Deer. And I think coincides in general with Colin Farrell's kind of reevaluation that now in movies by Lanthimos and now Martin McDonagh, that he's really revealed to be this really world-class actor who has a great control of tone and really servicing the film that he's in, as opposed to just being the bland leading man star they kind of tried to make him for many years. So,
or Bullseye in Daredevil.
Right. So this was much more successful in my mind, and but he does come back for The Killing of a Sacred Deer, where I think he is just as great. I'm a big fan of this movie as well. And I guess my first question then, also we have, Nicole Kidman and a lot more recognizable faces than in his early movies. But yeah, my first question is, how would you classify this? Is this a horror movie? Because at times it seems to come kind of close, but I don't know. Where do you guys land on that?
I will say that I think that this The Killing of a Sacred Deer is probably the closest to Doctor than his other films. I feel like The Lobster and The Favorite and even Alps lean a little more into the dark humor in a way that's perhaps just a touch more accessible. Not that those movies don't have their own sort of like, violent sequences and sort of like deranged moments, but I do feel like the tone of The Killing of a Sacred Deer, it's never funny. It's a very dark movie, and it might be his darkest, even darker than Doctor in my opinion. And it's interesting that he did this after The Lobster, because The Lobster was nominated for an Oscar for best screenplay, which again, it's one of those rare occasions in which I feel like some members of the Academy actually recognize the originality and the sort of peculiar voice of a writer director like Yorgos Lanthimos. And so for him to right after that Oscar nomination and sort of like the continued success, moves on to making this very dark movie about a strange vendetta that takes an otherworldly situation that's very uncomfortable, sort of just rattles you in a way that I think none of his other movies do. Again, because I think all the other ones lean a little bit more into sort of the dark humor. This one just feels malevolent from beginning to end. And I think that has to do a lot with Barry Keoghan's great performance as Martin, the young kid that enters the family life, as you mentioned. Colin Farrell, Nicole Kidman are now a couple. He's a surgeon who connects with this young man who enters their lives and then sort of destroys them with a strange vendetta. I don't know how much I want to say about the plot, but yeah, I think it's an interesting sort of trajectory that he's gone on.
Yeah, and it's interesting to bring up genre and Yorgos, which I do think he is. I couldn't help but think about it this time around, that he is a good example of someone who he is able to work in like at this higher level, but does still like create something weird. And I think he does escape genre for the most part, even though it has horror elements. I can't help thinking that he must have been a influence on some of the more like successful horror movies, like Hereditary and like maybe even The Witch and things like that are trying to push for this more like, they still fall into like I think more of a genred horror movie feel, but there's more of this I don't know, going for the jugular as far as like various like relationships or families, making it very personal and making the situations more surreal. It feels like maybe he's in, like, they are in conversation with him. I couldn't help but think that, like Ari asked, something like Ari Aster being, I can imagine they're a fan. But yeah, I mean, really what we have is the closest thing I can see is like a Twilight Zone episode, like a really, really intense, long Twilight Zone episode, because we do have, like, even down to it being this kind of impish, like, otherworldly creature who comes in, like, um, is his name Martin? The boy who comes in and changes the entire trajectory of this man's life, like, which he thinks he's got everything, and then all of a sudden, like, it's all shattered by him meeting this little weird person, which I think is struck me very Twilight Zone.
To me, it reminds me. I think actually, to me, what it makes me think of the films of Michael Haneke, like you mentioned, he's been compared to specifically Funny Games. I think that there's a tonal sort of like synchronicity between Funny Games and the Killing of a Sacred Deer, in the sense that the characters that are committing the evil acts in both of them express, they're doing it with a sort of righteousness and almost like a joyfulness to commit evil crimes. I mean, one could argue that in the case of Barry Keoghan's character, he has a reason. He's sort of like avenging someone, and the guys in Michael Haneke's Funny Games are being evil for the sake of committing evil crime, evil acts. But I think that there's a parallel in the tone, and this sort of very unnerving. And to me personally, whenever someone asks me what's the movie that I found the scariest, I always say Funny Games, because to me that's probably that notion of people being capable of committing evil acts just for no reason, for their own enjoyment. I think that's the most terrifying thing, and I think that uncomfortable feeling that Funny Games evokes in me personally, I feel the same way with the Killing of a Sacred Deer and in Barry Keoghan's character. So I don't know if Yorgos has ever spoken about Michael Haneke as an influence, but I feel like that's I would probably place this one with Funny Games and make a very terrifying double feature.
Oh, that would be horrible. And I totally agree about Funny Games, which we have covered on this podcast, because that's another film that
the American or the original?
The original. Yeah, even though it's hardly a difference between them, but it's subtle at least. And it was, these are both movies that you could argue about whether they fall into, are they thrillers, are they horror films, are they art films, like, above all. But whatever you want to call them, especially Funny Games, just gets under my skin, like, much more than most horror movies that I could even name. So I totally agree on that point. And they're both very high concept, and Lanthimos seems to work with these high concepts so much, which is why I think, Seth, where that Twilight Zone thing has come from, you could almost say that about every single one of his movies, at least pre The Favorite, that they all dig into human nature and psychology with these fantastic concepts, and I think he really does them justice. What strikes me about this movie is, on one level you have the actual premise, which I'll go ahead and spoil because I think it's kind of important, but basically Colin Farrell is forced to choose somebody in his family, either his son, daughter, or wife, to kill, or else they are all going to slowly lose the ability to walk and eat and die. And it's kind of this supernatural curse that we never really get a clear explanation on, not too unlike how we don't get any exposition about the parents in Dogtooth. You just kind of, or what's happening in The Lobster. It's this kind of magical realism you just have to accept. And I think what helps us accept it in the case of this particular movie is, even though it takes place on Earth, everybody has this alien quality, that all of the dialogue is very stilted. The performances are very deliberately drained of affect. And for a movie about a guy who is a surgeon, I think it's kind of appropriate that everything is approached in this clinical way that seems to have taken over the whole Earth, which some people might find irritating as an affectation, I guess, as far as how the movie is. But I think it actually ties into the premise that we need to accept, as well as the way we see Colin Farrell slowly broken down and actually expressing some kind of emotion that almost nobody does.
I think it makes it even more suffocating for me that I feel like there's no one really to hang on to at a certain point. That I think like if there was like Colin Farrell, like who is like apparently like the hero or something, he is still like this, like he has these weird layers of performative denial. Everybody has like these weird things that they're performing, which which makes it a lot more like frustrating and like stressful for me.
Yeah,
I think that's a good
and
thing
I
to
and
point
I feel
out.
like you could say that Barry Keoghan is the agent of chaos that forces them out of that, right? That they all continue going with their lives in this very stoic way, but when he kind of like shifts their world on its axis and faces to confront with the possibility of catastrophe striking this their perfect life, then that's when they sort of their behavior changes, and he particularly becomes more emotional. And one could say that that might be related to the fact that he continued with his life despite the fact that someone else lost his life, and that to him is just another job, and he can casually brush it off and like move on with his life, while this other kid has his entire world has now become avenging this person, that bringing justice to the world in a strange way. And so I think that the title is very appropriate because it ties in with this notion of a almost like an ancient mythological sort of a way of finding justice, right? Almost biblical in the sense of like an eye for an eye, and sort of like thinking about justice in a very visceral way that's almost detached to how society operates today. It's really kind of like a very a visceral, violent, biblical way of approaching justice that just elevates kind of like the otherworldliness of the story.
Yeah, the continual mantra that the family keeps saying throughout at least the first part of it is like it's fine, um, which I think the malevolent character at this is constantly trying to like explain that it is not fine. A sacred deer has been killed. Like there must be penance. There must like there is no escape from this. It's almost as if like it's easy to say that he like puts a curse on them, but there's nothing like that. It almost is like the way he sits Colin Farrell down and is just like, this is what's going to happen. He just says it very plainly, like it is just like a cause and effect. Because this happened to my father, now this is going to occur to your family unless you do X. As if it is just like this thing that must occur.
But he believes it because he feels guilty, though. Like, I think my theory has always been that he poisoned them, that there's like a physical thing that he did to them for this to
I have
happen,
wondered that.
and that Colin Farrell character believes that this curse has been placed upon him, or that eventually believes that it's been placed upon him because of his own guilt. That he, associates this with sort of like it's awakening in him the guilt that he never confronted for this or whatever other that. And so to me, that's to me there's always been a physical explanation for it, just that he believes it. And of course the fact that he's a doctor who shouldn't believe in any sort of otherworldly mystical things kind of adds to that idea of like, how could you even believe this thing when you're a man of science, right? And eventually even you who are a man of science falls prey to the unexplainable because of your own guilt.
Yeah, I think that's his main
Yeah.
arc in the movies. He's constantly trying to just reason and rationalize his way out of the situation and refuse to accept it. He's constantly dragging his kids around and trying to force them to walk and snap out of it, or force them to eat when they won't. And it's a long journey to when he finally does kind of have his emotions spill over fighting with his wife, or when we finally see him cry. And it's drawn out by this, like you said, biblical. It's this Old Testament eye for an eye logic that in the end he can't escape from. So it is powerful in that way, and it also makes it very specifically about how he has to make this decision, which is so, I mean, it's so dark. It's hard, you can hardly even call it funny. But when it gets to the point where his family, each member is trying to curry favor with him and apologize for misbehaving, or the little boy cuts his hair to try and get on his dad's good side, to the point where when Colin Farrell goes to, like, I don't know, a school principal or guidance counselor, and is basically trying to ask him, like, well, do you especially like one of the kids more than the other if you had to choose between them? And
yeah, which one has more potential?
Trying to outsource his decision is that's outrageous. That is some dark stuff there.
Well, that's fascinating what you said.
Old Testament. That has Old Testament written all over it. The
Yes.
notion of like choosing one of your children, and and then God will sort of, because you trusted in it and you decided to kill your son, you will be rewarded. But at the same time, I also think that Barry Keoghan's character Martin, whether he's poisoning them or whether he does have some supernatural power, whatever the case is, his threat only works because we live in a society that's ruled by logic and science. And so if Colin Farrell goes to the police or goes to anyone to claim that this kid has cursed them and that these things are happening to his children because he's cursed them, no one will believe him. And so that's really the power that Barry Keoghan has, and that his curse is so immaterial or hard to prove or whatnot that no one will believe that this is actually happening. And so that's really his kind of stronger ammunition, the notion that no one will believe that this is actually happening to this family.
And that is one of the things that was coming into my mind this time, which I feel like the first time I watched it, it was just purely like, this is mystical, magical realism or something going on. But this time I was trying to track it a little bit and was wondering if there is more readings, like even like just wondering, like, is it the mom's talking about her lemonade, like Martin's mom's talking about lemonade, like he's talking about doing this and that, and I was just wondering if there is something, which is to me like even darker, like and bleaker, if there is something to it, that it is more just like earthbound, that he's tricking them and he is poisoning them, like causing this himself by like natural means, which, yeah, I mean, there is even some levity to the theory that it's like a sacred ritual that is taking place and it is justice. Like, that it's just much worse in my mind for some reason, that it is like actually him poisoning him and manipulating them into eventually.
But what is the difference though? Because even if he's not poisoning them, then let's assume he has some kind of power. He has invoked this power against them. So it is, whether he's doing it by airbound means or by otherworldly means, his intention has always been to harm them. So to me, it's much less about how is he doing it. It's about this sort of like joy that he gets from doing it, from the act of like causing harm to his family. Because at the end, I mean, sorry, spoiler, but at the end, when he sees this family again in the restaurant, now that one of the members of this family is no longer alive, he smiles and sort of like he's, justice has been served and now life can continue. But that's clearly not the case for this family that went through this trauma. So I think to me it's much less about, I think that he poisoned them, but even if we don't know the clear answer, I think it's really about like his intention was always to use either medicine against them if he's poisoned them, or to use the powers of the gods against them. And so the intention to me is what's the sort of perverse thing here, whatever the means, to achieve his curse.
I think
and the most satisfying means being that he is weaponizing and like turning them against each other, basically, which is that's the most tragic thing. It's more tragic than just doing it yourself, is getting them to do it themselves, which was so heartbreaking about it.
There's a really revealing scene too where Barry Keoghan's character is tied up in the basement and has a conversation with Colin Farrell, because he does attempt, I mean, he really does try everything as far as getting the medical attention, and it takes him a long time into the runtime of the movie to finally accept that he has to make this decision. And he even tries tying up and torturing Martin. And there's a moment there where Martin bites Colin Farrell, excuse me for mixing up actors and character names. And he says, all right, don't you see that the only way for me to make good is this? And then he bites a chunk of flesh out of his own arm. And he's yelling at him, Don't you understand? It's metaphorical. It's a symbol. He comes out and says that. And that kind of is his whole plan in a nutshell, is it's a lesson. It's a metaphor. And however it's happening, and there's no way out of it. And I think that the secondary thing this movie ends up being about is his continued unwillingness to take responsibility, even when he's deciding that he is, okay, I got to pick somebody to kill. So besides that, he tries going to the principal to get their opinion on the matter. And, we hear earlier on when he's talking about being responsible for the death on the operating table of Martin's father, he has kind of a funny line of just dismissively saying a surgeon never kills a patient. Anesthesiologist is always the one who kills the patient. And the anesthesiologist says the opposite line. Yes. And then, but when it gets down to, even when he has to decide who to kill, the way he does it by putting on a blindfold and spinning around with a shotgun is like still a way that he abdicates responsibility at the end. Which I'm not saying that's an easy decision to make, but it kind of like he makes it all the way to the end of the film, still with distancing himself from having to make the most difficult choice.
Right.
Yeah, because the responsibility is the most horrific part of it for him. And, that is the real burden of it all.
Yeah, and that's the difference between him and Barry Keoghan's character, because Barry Keoghan's character accepts the responsibility of the evil that he's doing, but he sees them as a justified thing. He accepts that responsibility, but he sees it as a justified sort of like vendetta against this man who perhaps has never been responsible for his part in the suffering of others.
And speaking of Barry Keoghan, we all agreed that this is like a phenomenal performance, especially since he was kind of more of a newcomer when this film came out. I think it's such a tricky balancing act for everybody in the cast, and I think everybody is great. And I can only imagine the work they had to do with the director to make sure they were all on the same page about the peculiar tone of this movie. But yeah, Barry Keoghan is so creepy, and the way that he explains the rules, just rushing through them like he has them memorized and just kind of has to say them like it's not even his idea. It's so uncanny. It's really brilliant, I think.
He looks just like a kid who walked off the street. He does not look like some Hollywood actor, like some teen heartthrob, like young actor or something. He just looks like a schlubby guy, which makes it even more like startling when this kid starts talking like insane shit and like really threatening ways.
Yeah, I think he's really in a few years kind of like demonstrated that he has a lot of range, because because the character he plays in, he's nominated for The Adventures of Inisherin, which is a very different sort of like more innocent, sweet kind of small town kid who's looking to fall in love or whatnot. So yeah, it's a very different performance here, and I think the movie really works because of him, because I feel like that to me is the most challenging part, to be this agent of chaos and play against the entire family.
Now he's gonna be the Joker. With they need to just make Colin Farrell Batman. I think that would be good.
I didn't know he was gonna be the Joker. That's too bad, but oh well.
Yeah, people I can tell they probably like saw this movie and that was like where their mind went, I guess. But that's not where my mind would go necessarily. But.
Well, he was. Yeah, I mean, he has a little cameo, I guess, in the last Batman movie. Who knows if they'll necessarily. Right. It doesn't necessarily mean they'll stick with him going forward, I guess, but there is a clip going around of a deleted scene, a whole big long scene that you can see with him as a Joker, which seems a little obvious. He's kind of has a hold on creepy little troublemaker guys.
Yes,
in like every movie that he's in.
Naughty imp.
Yeah, well, he's as naughty as he's ever been in this film. But yeah, I was when we were first conceiving of this episode and thinking about Dogtooth, that seemed like a really obvious good one to talk about. And I was wondering is the killing of a sacred deer really on that level as far as, the concept of this podcast, or it being something that's hard to watch. But, rewatching it again, I was like, yeah, this actually seemed a lot darker than Dogtooth, because the absurdity is less comic, and you have stuff like the mother getting into bed and saying, once they kind of know that a decision has to be made, and she just kind of admits that she doesn't want killed either, and just flat out tells him, we can always have another kid. We're old enough. And that it's chilling.
It's an easy vein to like just really wreck for me. I don't know, and a lot of viewers, I've heard a lot of people like have a lot of trouble with this because it hits home. Like, you can, even though these are very specific characters and a like specific situation, you can't help but like do your own thought experiments, like how, like, well, that's my dad in this situation, that's my mom in this situation. Like once you bring it to the family level, it really does, it hurts.
Well, I think it hurts because you realize, at least to me, I think that it would hurt if you kind of like extrapolate it to your own family. It hurts because the film, what it's saying in terms of the family dynamic, is that once it comes to survival, is everyone for themselves. They're all, like you mentioned, trying to curry their favor of the father to be the one that survives, even if they consciously know that for them to survive, the other one has to die. But at that moment, survival kicks in, and sort of those familial ties and bonds kind of like mean nothing. So when you kind of extrapolate it to your own family, you realize that perhaps, but will my family react in the same way? Will my siblings want to survive that much that they would, try to, get in the favor of the father? That to me is what makes people uncomfortable. I don't know if it's so much an emotional reaction, is a reaction of sort of realizing again, the darkest parts of human nature, of what we're capable of, in securing our own safety or in securing our own power or whatnot. And so, yeah, I think that's what makes these movies so interesting. The same with like The Lobster. It's also about, you have a deadline. If you don't fall in love by this point, you will become an animal and potentially die as an animal. And so this sort of like courtship and love and this idealized thing that we believe that should happen organically, and you should meet the person and fall in love, then because it becomes a game of survival, becomes a game of like, I need to find someone, or I'm gonna become a lobster or a dog or whatever. And so I think that that's why I will say that most of his films will make a lot of people uncomfortable, because by the satire kind of unveils or reveals very specific truths about human nature.
We're not as safe as we thought we were. Yeah, that's what both of these movies do for me, which really makes you squirm in a whole other way.
Yeah, if Lanthimos is behind the camera, then you are not safe. But well then, Seth, why don't we start out with you then, as far as any final thoughts about this movie, anything that we didn't get to, or I don't know, anything that you don't like about it, anything you might want to throw out there. Does this, I'm just curious, is this like, where does this rank in the Lanthimos oeuvre for you?
I like this. I don't know, maybe it's like my third favorite. I do like the favorite second. I did really enjoy that. I think it was just, maybe the favorite is interesting just to see what he can do as a director, like maybe like out of his element in a different sort of way. It was really exciting to see that. I don't know, it was very novel. I don't know necessarily how I feel about it next time I see it, probably, but this one I think is just really exciting how it was received and how it is. Like, I would love to see more movies like it in mainstream theaters. And like, I just feel like I got to talk to a lot of different people about a director that I never thought I would be talking with them. Just like, I just know a lot of like very regular moviegoers that saw this movie and were really affected by it. And it really like brought up like big questions and things like that like ordinarily they aren't very like adventurous moviegoers. So I think that's what's really exciting about it. And I would love to see more stuff like this. I'm so happy he's able to reach this larger audience. And I agree, still retain his fucked up weirdness. I think it's a really good, powerful movie.
All right, yeah, and again, I'll let Carlos have the last word. So I'll just say that this is, I think, the third time I've seen this film, and I think I like it a little more every time. It was definitely one of my favorite films the year that it came out, even though I still give Dogtooth the slight edge. And really, the only thing that always underwhelms me a tiny bit is maybe the very, very ending, like the closing shots can't really compare to, like, say, the last shot of Dogtooth, which is just so perfectly ambiguous and leaving open all these possibilities. And I'm not sure he necessarily found in this case a stinger quite worthy of what came before, but that's a small complaint. And I
I
feel like,
totally agree with that.
Mhm.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And I feel like just tonally, though, this is one of the craziest balancing acts, even before we get to the really crazy stuff. Um, as far as the entire film leading up to it and the way that it's written. And that's kind of a reason why I like The Favorite. I don't love it. And even whether he returns to doing things in his original language or not, I still would love to just see him working from his own scripts or with his co-writer, whose name escapes me, who's worked on these movies with him. And it is really interesting to see him kind of become this director for hire and see him work with other people's scripts. And I do think that he does a really good job with The Favorite, but they can't help but seem a little more ordinary even in their bizarreness compared to movies like this. So I know his next one coming up, he is writing, although it's adapting a novel. So I guess we'll see which side it lands on of how Lanthimosian it ends up being. But a film like this really makes me hope that he's not done with his own original ideas, because that's what I respond to most with him.
Yeah, his co-writer's name is Eftimis Filippo, and he wrote Doctor Alps, The Killing of a Sacred Deer, and The Lobster with Yorgos. He didn't write the favorite, but I think the next one they're writing together again.
It's
So
great news.
hopefully that means that he's returning to that type of form. I will say that I like the favorite perhaps a little more than I like The Killing of a Sacred Deer, but I like all of his films. I don't think I've seen one that has disappointed me. Dogtooth might still be my favorite, and then follow very closely by The Lobster. So yeah, I found the interview I did with him was from 2016 when The Lobster finally got released in the U.S. because that was also kind of like a chaotic release because the movie had been bought by a distributor that sort of folded before they released it, and then the film was later picked up by A24, and it's sort of like it took a longer time to get released. So if anyone's interested in reading an interview that I did with him like 6-7 years ago on Movie Maker magazine, he talks about The Lobster and about Dogtooth a little bit, and the Greek wave, and sort of like whether there's an actual weird Greek wave or not. So yeah, I mean, my hope is always that people that find Doctor interesting look for the other Greek directors like Athena, Rachel Zangari, who are making similar kind of tonally similar films, also from Greece. And yeah, I mean, I'm excited for whatever Yorgos makes next.
All right. Well, I, for one, am absolutely going to check out that interview as soon as we're done here, because that sounds fascinating. And I want to thank you, Carlos, first for taking the time to do this and for picking these particular movies, because it really was great to go back and revisit these and to kind of see them with fresh eyes again. And I was great for somebody to show the enthusiasm for them. So
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Yeah.
Were you going to say something,
No,
Tony?
I'm just rejoining the party here for the end.
Oh,
Yeah.
you're just popping back up. All right. So is
He's
there
just
anything
popping in, killing sacred deers.
is there
popping
anything
out.
that you want to plug or direct anybody to, or anything that you have coming up or working on in particular?
I guess if this comes out after the Oscars, I've been working on a piece about movies that take place in one location with one actor. So I've been talking to a few directors that made those very specific kind of specific subgenre, like Buried or Lock or The Guilty, movies that have one actor and in one location. So I'm writing a piece on that I'll be sharing soon. Yeah, I mean, Twitter is where I'm usually very active, sharing my work and other bunch of silly stuff. Carlos_film.
Awesome. We'll put that in the
All
episode.
right. Yes, I do follow Carlos on Twitter as well. So we will link to that, and there's always lots of good stuff being posted there, or just funny thoughts and observations. And hope maybe we'll see whatever Lanthimos does next, and catch up with you again at some point.
Sounds good.
All right.
I'm gonna go ahead and stop us here.
Then, okay.
You gotta knock your dog tooth out first, though. You can't leave until you've knocked it out. So
That's the only way out of Zencast.
Let's see you do it.
Unwatchables is produced by Tony Scarpitti, hosted by me, Marc Dottavio, and Seth Troyer, with artwork by Micah Kraus. You can find Seth and I on Letterboxd under Marc Dottavio and Sloth Troyer. You can also check us out at unwatchablespod.com for links to our Twitter and Instagram, or support us on Patreon for bonus content and to have a say in what we watch. Thanks for listening.